As industry grows and the need for workers grow, there's a wave of immigrants to the United States. Prior to 1870, most of the immigrants that had come to the United States were from the north and the west of Europe. And, we're talking from the British Isles, Norwegians, Danes, Germans, French, Spanish, those kind of people. But in the 1890s and to 1920, immigrants began to come from the southern and eastern parts of Europe. Places like Italy, Greece, Hungary, Poland, Russia, and Czechoslovakia. They weren't Protestant, and many were Catholic, Jewish, and Orthodox. So very different than what had been coming to the country prior to that. Many of them also didn't speak English, and so they met prejudices, but so did most immigrants at the time. Many of these immigrants are coming because of push and pull factors, which are pressures that forced immigrants from their home countries and drew them to a new one. So some of those push factors are things like lack of economic opportunities, shortages of farmland, few educational opportunities, religious discrimination, and threats of being drafted into wars. Europe at this time, there's a lot of these small wars going on between countries. Then you had pull factors. Many of them were hoping for greater economic opportunities, were hoping for plentiful farmlands at affordable prices, looking for political and religious freedom in the absence of war, and there was a demand for labor. Many of these large corporations were actively recruiting people from foreign countries to come here and work in their factories. But of course, as more people from outside of this country are coming here, we see a lot of prejudices. Okay, and so there was this Americanization movement, which was a movement to immerse immigrants in what they defined as American culture and transform them into true Americans. So offering English classes and lessons in American history and government. Some immigrants embraced this, others rejected it. There was a peak for Americanization during World War I, when we end up fighting against many of the Europeans who had come here. Things like you couldn't speak German anymore, papers couldn't be printed in foreign languages. Some came to appreciate this coexistence of different cultures, which is called pluralism. So this idea of that melting, right? Not keeping your distinct cultures. In 1892, European immigrants arriving on the East Coast began being processed at Ellis Island. But before Ellis Island, they had been processed at Castle Garden in Lower Manhattan, which is now called Castle Clinton. So the picture on the top right is an aerial image of it. This picture that's on the bottom is actually a picture I took when I visited there this summer. I didn't get to go in, but this is the front entrance gate. The problem was that it wasn't large enough. Okay, between 1855 to 1890, 8 million immigrants were processed at Castle Garden. But by this time, there are so many people coming that the government had to establish a new location. Hence, Ellis Island. So at Ellis Island, you can see these are images I took this summer. This is the front facade of Ellis Island on the bottom. And then, of course, it's a National Museum of Immigration now. Once you got there, it took a while to process and be let go into the world, so to say. So examinations typically took 3 to 7 hours. You had to answer questions about how you were going to support yourself in the United States. You had to have a medical exam. Aid workers and social workers were often there trying to provide clothing, counseling, and money for these newcomers. A lot of times you had to have a sponsor who would help support you, and you're required to give proof of that. Medical exams, things as simple as pink eye, could land you back on a ship returning back to where you came from. Unhealthy or unable to support yourself, you would be barred entry and returned to your home country. About 2% of the immigrants who came to the United States through Ellis Island met this fate. In 1924, Ellis Island closed. And during the time that it was open from 1890 to 1924, more than 12 million people had passed through their doors. The Statue of Liberty, which was a gift to the United States on its 100th anniversary from the French of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, was placed in New York Harbor. And it really became this symbol of welcoming immigrants to the United States. It was unveiled in 1886, and Lady Liberty's torch of freedom was raised to the sky, and it stood as a symbol of the welcoming spirit of the United States. There's a poem that is inscribed on the base of the Statue of Liberty, and it's written by Emma Lazarus, and it's called The New Colossus, and we'll read it in class together. The two images you see here are images I took this summer when I visited. They were doing work on the base, so I actually couldn't get right up by her. I did go on the island, of course, but yeah, so, and we'll look at some other pictures here too. Immigrants on the West Coast, so on the East Coast, they're coming through Ellis Island. People on the West Coast, who are mostly Asian immigrants, are coming through Angel Island in the San Francisco Bay. Mainly, they're from China and Japan. Angel Island opened in 1910 to process immigrants and control the number of Chinese immigrants. There were many, many prejudices against the Chinese. Remember that the Chinese had been used to build the railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad, and they had a very strong presence in California. In 1882, we see the nation's first federal immigration law, and that's the Chinese Exclusion Act. And essentially what they were trying to do is to prevent Chinese from coming to the United States to work here. Okay. However, immigration from Asia continued, but it was restricted to professionals only. If you were a laborer, so if you were just coming here like many Europeans were to find wealth and find a good job, you wouldn't be able to come here. You had to be able to prove that you had a skill or you had education to be able to come here. 5% of Chinese immigrants were turned away. So 2% at Ellis Island, 5% here. And those living in the United States already had to obtain certification to re-enter if they traveled outside the U.S. and wanted to return. The Geary Act was passed because the Chinese Exclusion Act expired in 1892. And so what the Geary Act did is it extended restrictions for another 10 years, and it was set to expire in 1902. Congress ends up extending this permanently. So this restriction on the number of Chinese people and the types of Chinese people that are allowed into the United States is not repealed until the 1940s. Okay. Those denied admission could appeal, but this could take weeks, months, and even more than a year, and you'd have lengthy interrogations, and people were imprisoned there for quite a while. And so there are actually carved poems in the walls and things at Angel Island. It was crowded, it had barbed wire surrounding it, and there were armed guards watching the Chinese as they were at Angel Island. With industrialization, remember there's a shift from rural to urban, and so cities grew. The unfortunate thing is housing couldn't keep up with the number of people that were immigrating here and migrating from rural areas. You know, the wealthy lived in these rich, spacious apartments, but the working class and immigrants lived in what they called tenements. They were about 6 to 7 stories tall. They had multiple apartments in it. They were found on narrow lots. They were poorly ventilated, overcrowded, and ill-maintained. So these tenement houses were built so as many people as possible could fit in there. And the ventilation was substandard, non-existent. The sanitation was terrible, so disease spread, and it also made them incredibly prone to fires. Many of the immigrants who were coming here settled in neighborhoods that reflected their ethnic backgrounds. They built churches and synagogues. They formed mutual aid societies to provide services and supports for the residents there. Also, we had that assimilation happening, the blending in and adopting of American ways of life. Communities built schools and theaters and concert halls and demonstrated that immigrants truly were committed to their new country. And this was very much supported by the Americanization movement. But if you go into places like New York City that had heavy immigrant populations, you run into these neighborhoods, right? Little Italy, Little Chinatown. You know, there's all these where these ethnic groups built these communities supporting one another. Even with many assimilating, they still had a lot of prejudice. Nativists felt threatened. They felt that the cultural values and the competition for employment were issues. They wanted to restrict immigrants through literacy tests and quotas. And it was really aimed at the Catholics and the Jews. That's why the Irish had a really hard time when they first came here in the 1840s and 50s. A lot of it had to do with that they were Catholic. And Catholics drink wine. And a lot of times Protestants were not into liquors and things like that. And, you know, they were not willing to accept these people, even though they're all Christians. In 1887, the American Protective Association is established, and it's actually established right here in Iowa. It was a secret society of white native-born Protestants. And what they did is they used propaganda to exploit the fears about an unstable economy and the perceived negative influences of immigrants. They specifically, again, target the Catholics. So, you know, if your relatives were here much before 1900, a lot of your families are from Czechoslovakia and background, Bohemia, even German Catholics. They would have been targeted at this time. And like I said, the American Protective Association uses propaganda, which is spreading purposely misleading and usually negative information about a group or a product. And in this case, again, it's the Catholics. In 1907, Teddy Roosevelt and the Japanese government come up with this international document called the Gentleman's Agreement. And what it essentially did was created a quota system, kind of like what we had with China, okay? Japan agreed that passports would only be granted to the educated businessmen and other professionals, and workers who were just coming here to find jobs and try and better their lives wouldn't be allowed. In response, the United States, or Roosevelt, agrees that the San Francisco school systems will be desegregated, okay, and Japanese students will be allowed to go to school with white students. The agreement didn't end the prejudice, though. Californians worried that the Japanese would control all the best farmland, and 1,000 Japanese immigrants were arriving every month, and most of them were farmers. When we get into World War II and we get into the internment camp system, we see a lot of these deep-seated prejudices that are built right now really come to fruition. In the late 1800s, Chicago is a mess. Okay, so it's described as first in violence, deepest in dirt, loud, lawless, unlovely, ill-smelling. Criminally, it was wide open. Socially, it was thoughtless and raw. And so there's a lot of crime, a lot of homelessness, a lot of destitution. And so this rich middle class, or I shouldn't say rich, she was upper middle class. She attended college. She had studied medicine. She didn't graduate, but, you know, she was educated. Her name is Jane Addams. And while visiting a settlement house in London, she discovered her purpose. She found all of these people who were downtrodden, who were living in filth and waste, and she decided that she was going to come back and do something about it within her own country. In 1889, she and a friend lease a house in a poor immigrant neighborhood in Chicago, and they call it the Hull House. It created programs to help that neighborhood, things like kindergarten and daycare, clubs for older children, classes and activities for adults, playgrounds, libraries, boarding houses for girls to get an education, and they fundraised among the wealthy. They crusaded for improvements throughout the city, and Jane Addams actually serves on the city's Board of Education and worked as a garbage inspector. She became well known nationally, but she was controversial. During World War I, she speaks out against the war. She supported labor unions and criticized American capitalism. And she was called the most dangerous woman in America by J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI. In 1934, however, she receives the Nobel Peace Prize, and her legacy becomes that she was supportive for all people. She helps establish the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. She helps establish the American Civil Liberties Union, and she serves on the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. The Hull House continued to operate until 2012. After 122 years, it closed, and now it serves as a museum in Chicago.